So when we talk about chronic otitis media, what I'd like to kind of present to you is maybe shifting the paradigm a little bit, making people think a little bit differently about it, because essentially we're all trained that the first thing you should do, and chronic otitis media is managed in buckets. We've got the chronic otitis media or Cholesteatoma piece. We have to create a safe ear. Once we've established a safe ear, then we start thinking about hearing restoration. And I'll show you some data that we found that's pretty interesting. But what I'd like to challenge people is in your initial surgical planning, you should be planning for what your hearing restoration is going to be. I think we have this whole potpourri of things that we can do with wonderful implants. You can sample tomorrow in the course. There's also the various osseointegrated technologies. So you've got the Baha Connect, you've got Ossia, you've got Bone Bridge from MED-EL. The problem that we have is that when Cochlear launched their Ossia product, they launched in the United States at a higher price than you get paid for doing it. So we can't do them in our surgery centers, and we can't do them in the hospital. So, and you saw earlier in Pete Manis's talk that Cochlear engaged the RUC, the Relative Value Committee, around the American Academy of Otolaryngology and advised them not to do that. The idea was to get a higher CPT code payment, a higher RVU rate for the Ossia, because they don't want to compromise on their price. What they ended up with is they cut Baha Connect reimbursement in half, and the reimbursement they got for the Ossia device was 2 RVUs less than what we had before. So the moral of the story is, don't be stupid. I didn't say that. I think the other thing that's really fascinating is what started out with Frank Lin at Hopkins, with all the evidence that's coming out supporting hearing loss as the single leading cofactor or risk factor for early onset dementia. Now, what's very interesting is all of his work is really centered on hearing loss. And I would argue to you that if the sound can't get to the inner ear, you still have an 80 dB hearing loss in that ear. And so some of these implications we need to be really thinking about as we're planning chronic otitis media. The other thing that's very fascinating, this is a report that came out of the World Health Organization, and it shows that chronic otitis media may contribute more than half of the global burden of hearing loss in the world. I mean, that's a very significant number, and that's a 2004 report, and the subsequent reports have all been very supportive of that. What's really clear is when you go surgeon to surgeon, sometimes the same surgeon on different days, we have no real standard of care, no best practice about how to address hearing loss. And I'll show you some data in just a minute. But when we really want to attack this, and you want to make it so that people have a paradigm that makes sense for treating chronic otitis media and treating hearing loss in chronic otitis media, that can be deployed in Nairobi, that can be deployed in London, that can be deployed in Seattle, College Station, anywhere, it really requires a systematic review of the data, and then trying to generate reliable data that you can generate a clinical best practice based on. So there's a difference between best practice and standard of care. And standard of care is what's typical in the community. And the standard of care around chronic otitis media is pretty unclear. I mean, it really just really relates to what region you're working in. So in 2019, there was a committee formed called the Hearing Health Initiative, and there was 8 of us originally on this, or 9 of us originally on this, representing each of the different regions in the globe. And what's really fascinating is you look at the incidence of hearing loss secondary to chronic otitis media at different parts of the globe, and it's pretty fascinating. China, enormous amount of chronic otitis media. What I think is interesting, and this relates to what Dan Zeitler was talking about earlier today, so what if we just take these same regions and we look at the indigenous populations in those areas? And the chronic otitis media rate and the hearing loss rate secondary to that is massive. The gentleman who represents Australia on this committee is the only Aboriginal surgeon in Australia. He is a native Aboriginal, comes from one of the tribes. And he was talking about his outreach, where he actually goes out with the Flying Doctors of Australia that you see on TV, hits these villages, and he says mothers are starting to come to him concerned because their children's ears were not draining. Everybody else's ears were draining. There must be something wrong with my child. They don't have pus coming out of their head. And he said the chronic otitis media rate in these small villages is over 70% of kids. The Aboriginal population, and I may get these numbers slightly wrong, but is about 3 to 3.5% of the Australian population and 71% of the Australian prison population. And classically, these kids get into juvenile detention because of behavior that they're not listening to authorities, they don't pay attention to police when they stop them, and they end up in juvenile court, and then they end up being tried, and then they end up being put in prison. And when he went and interviewed these kids, they didn't know why they were in prison. And then he started doing audiograms on them, and their hearing was so bad, they were not ignoring the cops, they couldn't hear the cops. And when they went to court, their lawyers weren't smart enough to know that they had no idea what was going on around them. They couldn't actually hear them. And his point is tympanostomy tubes in a remote village in Australia could lower the prison population by 50%. These kids weren't committing crimes. They couldn't hear anything. And you can hear these stories in China. You can hear these stories in India. Shockingly, you can hear these stories in Rainier Valley in Seattle, exactly 3 miles from the headquarters of Amazon.com. Right? So these are everywhere. And our indigenous populations, the native populations in Alaska, the native populations in Washington, have much more serious chronic ear disease. And is that because it's genetic, or is that because they're not getting the care they need? So this group came together to try to look at the world's literature and to try to start putting together what would be a paradigm for optimizing hearing loss as you're managing people for their chronic otitis media or cholesteatoma. And so when you look at osseointegration, and believe me, I'm not out here to market osseointegration. I'm not giving you any product names or anything like that, but just bone conduction is extremely effective. You could take those same kids in Australia and you could put skull candy bone conducting amplifiers on their mastoids, and you could turn their lives around. So let's just talk about bone conduction. But you take a woman like this in the lower left-hand corner of the screen, that's just a halo sign around a cochlea for advanced otosclerosis. You know, we really don't know what people do with osseointegrated devices with the third window effect, but we know that in a mixed hearing loss, they can be very effective. And this is a case actually that I did. If you look really closely, this is classic. Ossicular head fixation of the malleus and incus head, and it's just it's basically tympanosclerosis. And when you see tympanosclerosis affecting the ossicles, you know, it feels good to peel it out, feel like you've cured it, until they come back 4 years later and they've got a conductive hearing loss again. And so very, very difficult. So should these people have their chronic otitis media stabilized and go to some other form of amplification, now, whether that be a hearing aid, whether that be an osseointegrated technology? So this group so far has put together a couple of very interesting research papers, and this is the first paper that we did was a systematic literature review, and it was done by Aaron Lewis, who's based with the Cochlear Baja Center out of Australia. Out of Sweden, and really it showed that about 30% of people after their tympanoplasty and their ossiculoplasty had what we would consider an acceptable hearing result. 14% of these people were reported as complications. What's very interesting in this data is there was no standard used to judge postoperative hearing. So there wasn't a standardized scale, and we have them now all over the world that we can adapt. And a complication ranged anything from they got a recurrent tympanic membrane perforation to they had a CSF leak. So there was no real definition of severity of complication. We then did a registry study and looked through a whole Swedish registry, and it really showed that bone conductive devices were very cost effective because the average number of tympanoplasties and ossiculoplasties in this group was 3 surgeries. It doesn't matter whether you do it endoscopically or whether you do it open as a tympanoplasty. Some of these people are not going to respond well to ossicular chain reconstruction. So then we had an additional paper looking at the health-adjusted quality of life of these people, and it really, people just want to hear. And you start looking at depression scales, you look at social isolation scales, and for some of these people, it is important to go to a device or to a skull candy or something. The other thing that was very clear is don't wait till after their surgery, or if you do a stage procedure, is there an option that they can buy at Best Buy that can help them get through those 6 months while their hearing is down? When we look at the complication rates from that first study where we just looked at the world's literature, the complication rates vary from 0 to 47.1%. I don't know any surgeon in the universe that can do ear surgery without complications, but some people apparently do. 14% of these people had complications. The most common, which was 7% of that population, were just tympanic membrane perforations that were persistent. They did not list an unsatisfactory conductive hearing loss as a complication. And if you look at the air bone gap closure, it was achieved in 71% of patients. Last time I checked, that's a C- on an exam. So we're working really hard to suck at restoring hearing in a lot of patients with difficult chronic ear disease. And a successful hearing outcome for a lot of these studies was the physician determined that their hearing outcome was successful. Some that didn't even have audiograms. So that's a real neurosurgical move, by the way. Yeah, they did great. They put on makeup. They went home. Their face was paralyzed. They leaked CSF, and their legs didn't move. But they were happy. So anyway, I only say that because I work with neurosurgeons all the time, and I love them. But so results by subgroup, it's really interesting that the mean hearing outcomes for adult and pediatric patients were comparable. And patients with cholesteatoma had the largest air bow gap after surgery, followed by patients requiring ossiculoplasty. What's really interesting, it tells you the quality of the data when a system-wide literature review says the mean outcomes for hearing restoration in adults and children is identical. Because anybody in the room that does ear surgery will tell you that kids are tougher. Their disease is just tougher. So these are a couple of risk profiles that we've proposed as we're starting to now, the next phase of this is to build a worldwide database where people could just redact it so they can put into the database their hearing outcomes, and then we can start analyzing them and comparing them region to region around the world. And the chronic otitis media outcomes test, or CMOT, we figure the rhinologists get the SNOT test. That's pretty cool that your rhinologist in your questionnaire is SNOT. We tried to come up with something, that sounded as cool like Waxot or something like that, but didn't work. So we came up with the chronic otitis media test, and then also the middle ear index. And this is something that Thomas Lenartz out of Hanover, who does a lot of chronic ear surgery, really championed. And so these are very simple things that we're now piloting with a couple of centers in Europe to see how easy it is to use. And my issue is with all of what we do with medical records and what we do with tracking outcomes and charting, that it has to be something on an iPad you just tap and go, and it can't take more than about 30 seconds. So in conclusion, in the world literature as it stands today, 71% of people had a satisfactory outcome on their hearing reconstruction. This includes people who were staged, people who were repaired primarily, endoscopically open, so 71%. So we got to all stand up and pat ourselves on the back for getting a C- in hearing restoration. And I think that as we start looking at an open database, we can now prospectively start gathering data and looking at various outcome measures and start generating what we consider a true best practice. And what's really fascinating is talking to some surgeons from Jamaica, talking to some surgeons from some of the South African nations. They're very interested in the clinical best practice because it's something they can actually strive to follow that they believe has been developed and generated by surgeons that have a lot of experience in the area. So I think there's a big utility for this. And from that, we can generate a best practice guideline. The other question is, how many people, I don't know, how many people in here have ever repaired an auricular atresia? That's a very humbling operation to me. And it's really great when you put the Baha on after you've done this beautiful surgery you're all proud of, and they say, I can finally hear, doctor, thank you. But the hearing on that is extremely difficult to reconstruct in a lot of patients. So anyway, again, I am not anybody who is going to endorse any kind of one form of technology over the other made by a company. But when you look at osseointegration, you look at bone conduction, it's extremely powerful. And in my mind, I'm thinking, should we really dispense skull candy, bone conducting amplifiers for people's mastoids while they're going through the stage procedure of their mastoidectomy? And particularly kids that go to school, do they need an FM system, or do they need something that's going to give them bone conduction, at least temporarily? And this is actually the group. The gentleman in the lower right-hand corner is actually the surgeon from Australia. And I actually know an upcoming president of the Academy of Otolaryngology, so you might be hearing him speak at a meeting in Miami coming at you in the near future. So very respectable guy, and his story will absolutely bring you to your knees about what we need to do to help bring the world up to speed. So thank you.